Hanne founded the Comparative Literature program at the University of Auckland and directed it for 50 years. Got it. His research over the last 25 years has focused on the key roles played by narrative and metaphor in disciplines as diverse as medicine, politics, the law, and education. And he has convened conferences on these topics in New Zealand, the US, and the Netherlands, and edited books from each. Most recently, he's been looking at how metaphors and stories have been used to frame discussion around major issues in New Zealand. In this webinar, Michael Hanne will explore ways in which two issues, poverty and the housing crisis, are generally framed in public discussion in New Zealand. And he will offer critiques on that framing and ask how they might usefully be reframed in a socially more responsible way. He intends to end by inviting us to talk about issues that we feel need to be reframed. So now, without further delay, let's hear what Michael has to tell us. Over to you, Michael.
Yeah, can I just share my screen? So is that shared now?
Not yet, but it might come through. It might take a while.
Okay.
Here it comes. Here it is, Michael. All good. And I'm just going to select my view to side by side with speaker. And then anyone who speaks, you will see them. So I'm up there at the moment, but I'm going to be quiet now.
Right. So I should start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I feel before I start in talking about anything serious at the moment, it's right to acknowledge, I think, some of the appalling things that are happening in the world, specifically Israel and Gaza at the moment, but Ukraine in the background. I don't feel that I can forget those things as I'm talking to you. I want to start by honoring a good old friend of yours and a good old friend of mine, and that's Jack Woodward, who I know was one of the founders of your organization and who was a wonderful colleague of mine at the University of Auckland. I got to know Jack as one of the politically and socially progressive colleagues at the University of Auckland in the early 1980s, I should say. He was on the University Council, and he consistently pressed the case for measures that took account of the social obligations of the university. I was arguing at that time for a Labour Studies programme to be set up in the Faculty of Commerce at the University of Auckland. And Jack took up the cause on the University Council. The University Council, as you probably know, is the governing body of the university. It's not the Senate where all professors sit. So it has a large number of business people on. So Jack took up the cause on the University Council and argued successfully that the business school should be offering education and research resources to workers in trade unions, to labour, that would go some way to balance the resources that the university offered to management. And as I say, he won, persuading people who were very difficult to persuade. So he was socially responsible, thoughtful, willing to take a position not shared by most of the other people on the council. But Jack was also skillful in the way he expressed himself, in the way in which he persuaded people. In using that metaphor of balance, he was talking, of course, about fairness. That metaphor of balance is one that we use in so many different contexts. We use it around health, the work-life balance, balanced diet, potassium-sodium balance, balance of mind was disturbed. We talk about balance in a relationship. Other areas such as a balanced argument, balanced media coverage, restore balance between humans and nature. And as you well know, the scales, the balance is held by the figure of justice. All contexts. Balance has positive connotations. Now, in using the metaphor of balance, Jack Woodward illustrated the first key point that I shall be arguing, which is that we rely to an extraordinary degree on metaphor to make sense of the world for ourselves and in communication with others. And as soon as you think, oh, can't believe that, let me point out that the human and medical metaphors in structural engineering, especially, talk about the lifespan of a structure, metal fatigue, the aging of a structure. Talk about dams bleeding, diagnosing a problem, curing it, rehabilitation of a structure. And as I discovered when I was researching this, there is a discipline called pathology of construction. What are those metaphors doing? They're offering a lens or filter through which we view the subject, seeing a topic in terms of another domain. They're our attention in a particular way. Broadly speaking, they frame the topic. And I'll be very interested to hear later why and how you think that whole cluster of metaphors took on such a major role in engineering in the modern era. Now, the process of borrowing meaning from one domain for use in another to make a metaphor is one we employ constantly. Well, there's a swarm of metaphors, as I've said there, from the domain of health and medicine in engineering discourse. There's an equally large number of metaphors from the domain of engineering in almost every sphere of human existence and communication that you can think of. Take the metaphors engineering metaphors that are employed in education, for instance. We talk about building blocks of learning. Talk about foundational subject matter that has to be in place before the next layer of information is presented. We talk about an argument lacking structure. We talk about not just presenting information, but ensuring that it's cemented in place. We talk about teaching as scaffolding, where the teacher constructs around a topic support information as the student builds his or her understanding of the subject, and then that scaffolding is removed so that the student stands on their own. We talk about bridging the educational gap between Pākehā and Māori. Then there's a very special example, which I've separated off at the bottom. This was a phrase that was introduced in an article in the 1940s. And the whole sentence is, schools are social sorting machines, creating categories that serve as the foundation for inequalities in later life. I'd emphasize the inequalities in later life. So the suggestion was that rather than enabling each person to realize their individual potential, the education system was cementing inequalities in place. And this last is an example of a metaphor which offers us a fresh view or a fresh perspective on the topic. And in every area of science, philosophy, social sciences, engineering, I'm sure, you find such metaphors offering a fresh perspective. Another striking example of an engineering metaphor that allowed a new theory to be developed in anatomy and physiology was the discovery in the early 17th century that the heart is best viewed as a pump which circulates blood through the system, pumping oxygenated blood to most of the body and deoxygenated blood to the lungs to be reoxygenated. So discovery by analogy, if you like. And that discovery was only possible, that recognition of how the heart works was only possible because humans had invented water pumps only shortly before, and also because the existence of valves in blood vessels had just recently been discovered. So putting the one domain together with the other, it became evident that the heart was indeed a pump. Sorry, I'll go back. Previously, it seems hard to believe it, but the function of the heart had been described by thinkers from Aristotle to Descartes using a different metaphor, and the metaphor was the heart as a furnace. Now, this is the second main argument that I want to put, claim that I want to make. We make assertions and we argue very largely in terms of metaphors rather than fully developed arguments. We don't have to use them explicitly. They're there in the back of our minds. It's not that we're using them every day, but they are there. And certain kinds of metaphor are the dominant ones in society at any time. Metaphors from engineering are very widespread, as are metaphors from medicine, as I've shown. And this is an indication of the prestige that the two sciences and professions have gained over the last 200 years. In the case of engineering metaphors, it's now, of course, metaphors from computing that are strongest. In medicine, it's genetics. We hear day in, day out, people saying it's in this organization's DNA to do such and such. Sadly, the third dominant group are war metaphors. So engineering, medicine, and war are the three metaphor clusters which dominate so much of our discourse. Now, all these metaphors invite us in a loose sense to think in engineering terms, think in medical terms, or think in military terms in another domain. And that gives them extraordinary influence. And that places great responsibility on people trained in engineering and in medicine. So the fact that your metaphors from your domain are exercised so strongly in other domains is something for which you must eventually take some responsibility. And let's get back to the broader argument that we can't manage without metaphors, especially in thinking and communicating about complex and emotionally charged issues. Metaphors are essential. In many areas, there's a possible variety of possible metaphors around the topic. Take the situation of living with cancer. The dominant one is battle. He has struggled with cancer, he's battled with cancer, he's fought cancer for years. One which has been taking over from there is the notion of us journeying through cancer, or even with cancer as a companion. And lovely New Zealand philanthropist Rob Fenwick, in his last month, said he had been dancing with cancer for several years, but finally his partner had decided that the dance was over. Notice that each of those metaphors suggests an accompanying narrative. In other words, how to do something. If it's a battle metaphor, then you fight. If it's the journey, you're traveling. If dance, you're dancing. So there's a narrative sequel implication of the metaphor. What I'm going to argue is that we rely, in fact, not only on metaphor, but on narrative to make sense of the world. And a philosopher of history, Louis Mink, wrote in the 1970s, he said, narrative and metaphor are primary cognitive instruments. In other words, they are the prime instruments by which we make sense of the world. Now, this turns out to be particularly important in our thinking and talking about social, economic, political issues. Now, metaphor and narrative can be connected in several different ways, but I'm going to focus on one of them now. And it's one which was outlined by another thinker in the 1980s, Donald Schoen, who wrote that the metaphor that you use to define a social problem, it almost always generates the kind of solution that you will come up with or seek. So he said, for instance, these are the examples he used, that if you define the slum in your old city as a cancer, that almost inevitably suggests a policy which will involve cutting it out. If the slum is defined as an undernourished community, then what do? You nurture it, you feed it up. So he called these generative metaphors which generate action, which generate a policy narrative to resolve them. It sets you off in a certain direction. Now, metaphor and narrative, as used in public issues, are certainly not just ornaments or incidental tools, but often crucial for framing discussion. And that's the sense in which I'm talking about framing today. They offer what philosophers and psychologists call heuristics. In other words, mental shortcuts. If you can, you make sure that your metaphor cluster, your shortcut, is the standard one used in discussion. I'll give you some examples of that later. Now, we can see how productive that can be, but that can also be extremely dangerous. If you choose one lens, filter, or frame, you've usually excluded another one. At their worst, metaphor lenses or filters may be used to distort reality terribly. Think of speakers from Hitler to Donald Trump leading their audience to perceive minorities or migrants as rats, parasites, diseases, etc., etc. What follows from such narratives, from such metaphors, is the inevitable narrative of extermination or elimination. Most recently, Trump said that immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country. We can, sorry, I was momentarily distracted there. Too often in discussion about major social assumptions are made in the form of a metaphor and an associated narrative about the nature of the problem, and that those assumptions limit and distort the sorts of solutions that people will come up with. And my argument is therefore about how responsible citizens, not to mention responsible engineers, should be aware of, critique, and warn others about dangerous or misleading metaphors and narratives. Often you don't actually notice that you're thinking or speaking within a particular metaphorical frame yourself. We should be coining and using metaphors and narratives to positive purposes. And I'm thinking of metaphor and narrative pairs, which organize thinking about social, economic, political issues, such as poverty, which is one I'm going to talk about tonight, crime, climate crisis, and so on, and the need to critique and, where necessary, amend them. In other words, reframe the topic, reframe with different metaphors, different narratives. So, getting to the framing of poverty, this suggests some widespread assumptions made in New Zealand about poverty. First assumption, that there's a time people who are really poor in New Zealand is tiny in a generally prosperous society. Widely assumed that we're talking about a very small percentage of the population, between 2% and 5%, perhaps. For one reason or another, they are not sharing in the general prosperity. It's assumed that many people are poor because of poor life decisions. They've had too many children, they're involved in crime, they're either the subject of or initiators of poor parenting. And then that a safety net is required for those who get into difficulties, though it shouldn't become a feather bed. It shouldn't get too comfortable in it. Notice the use of metaphor there. Now, what I want to suggest is that behind those assumptions lie what can loosely be called the neoliberal metaphors of life as a race and life as a climbing ladder. Life is a race? Oh, as people say, there will be winners and losers. You can't all win the race. And if life is a ladder, how high you climb will be determined by how much effort you put into it. The underlying assumptions there are that we have equal opportunities to race or to climb, equal ability, and it's that individual effort that counts. Now let's see what happens if we employ a different metaphor. This is the metaphor of wealth in this country seen as a cake or a pie. I want you to look at how that pie in New Zealand is divided. This is taken not directly but indirectly from the work of Max Rashford. Many of you will know, I'm sure. What you see is the extraordinary differences in wealth owned by different sectors of the society. Look first at the blue sector. 1% of the population. Now, unfortunately, because of where our pictures are, you can't see just how much it is that they earn, that they own. But I can assure you it's 21.8%. So 1% of the population, stunning thought, owns 21.8% of our wealth. The next 9% of the population owns, and you can see the figure, 38%. So what we have there is the top 10%, the blue plus the red, owning almost 60% of the wealth in New Zealand. The next segment's an interesting 40% of the population owns 40% of the wealth. That would seem reasonably fair, actually, isn't it? But come to the very top of the cake, and you see that 50% of the population owns just over 1%, which I think is a stunning recognition, not one that is often enough reminded of, I think. Now, that doesn't mean that half the population is acutely poor. What it does mean is that half the population is struggling and at risk of becoming acutely poor. It should be obvious that wealth opens opportunities of every kind and opens choices to people. 50% of the population had that 50% who own 1%, that's over 1% of the wealth, have quite limited choices, and the least well off have almost no choices at all. Large proportions of the population start the race that neoliberals are talking about well behind, or don't see any ladders that they can climb. They don't have choices. They don't have those choices that they're accused of taking so badly. Indeed, they have a very limited frame through which they are able to perceive the world. The image of the wealth cake invites us to see the issue is not poverty. It should be reframed as inequality. Now, a wonderful man called Toby Morris has drawn this cartoon to show us how those statistics actually work out. You see, the guy on the left, he represents 10% of the population, and he's got 6 plates of food. The next 4 people at the table have got a plate each, which seems pretty fair. That's the 40% who own 40% of the wealth. The remaining 5, representing 50% of the population, have just half a plate to share between them. Broadly speaking, people on the left argue for redistribution. Of course, people on the right don't deny that wealth is divided unevenly. Let me go back to this image for a moment. Both of these metaphors, that's the cake and the dining table, suggest surely that we need to be sharing better. Seems pretty obvious from the dining table example, doesn't it? But both metaphors also pose the question, how did this happen? How did this come about? Has it always been like this? Is it individual greed, or is it a system that's wrong? And these are narrative questions, I suggest. So metaphors suggest narratives both of cause and solution. Now, as I said, broadly speaking, people on the left argue for redistribution. People on the right don't deny that wealth is divided unevenly, but they invite us to think of a different cake. This is the cake of GDP. You can see the components here: government spending, balance of trade, business investment, consumer spending. And when they are asked how might the poor be assisted, what they say is make the cake bigger, grow the cake. Growing, that's what we need to do. Now, if you go back to the cake image, and you think, well, what would happen if that cake grew by 2% or 4% in the coming year? Is it likely that the share is going to be equally distributed? The shares are going to be equally distributed? It's pretty obvious that the wealthy are going to be most rewarded, and the poor will be least rewarded. Now, notice that metaphors are crucial, not just in smart communication with others and in argument, but in how we think about social and political issues. Metaphors are the lenses or the frames through which we view issues. We want our metaphor cluster to be standard, the default setting in public discussion. So go back to the idea of generative metaphor. Metaphor for conceiving of a problem, describing a problem, generates the policy narrative for resolving it. Metaphor matter, and we fight over metaphors. Now, it's really important too that there are concepts that are not recognized as metaphors. A very good example of that, I think, is the market economy, taken by neoliberal speakers simply to be a reality. People bringing products to market with price being determined by supply and demand. It's taken not only to be the way things are, but the way things should be. The metaphor of the market is backed up by a set of hydraulic metaphors. Resources flow, the freest flow, the least interrupted flow is best. That's an example of a metaphor that dominates public discussion, but which I suggest is a neoliberal metaphor, which we need to question. I suggest we need to recognize that the market is just a metaphor, and it's only one of the metaphors that we might use. It's just one lever that we should be employing to ensure that human needs are met. So I'm suggesting that what is conventionally called the problem of poverty in New Zealand, especially child poverty, should be redefined as the problem of extreme inequality. And we should be asking the question, has it always been like that? How did it come about? What's to be done about it? I mentioned Max Rashbrook, and in his book, Too Much Money, he shows how the steepness of the slope between people on earning the lowest income and people on the highest income have increased over the years. Sorry, again, Thomas, are you able just for a moment to hide our pictures so that we can see the figures on the right?
I can't do anything at the moment.
Can't you? Okay, right.
And there's someone not muted.
I can, right. I didn't realize. Oh, no, they've gone somewhere else. I'll just hold them there for a moment. Okay, 1982. The average annual income of the poorest 10% was $12,000 per year. The average annual income of the richest 1% was $227,000. So about 20 times as much. Now see what happens by 2016, which were the last figures that Rashbrook had. The average annual income of the poorest 10% has grown to 15,000, right? So it's gone up by 1/4. The average annual income of the richest 1% has doubled, has more than doubled to $481,000. Comparison between these two slides, I'll go back and see the previous one, shows an extraordinary steepening of the slope. And this was largely result in its origins, the result of fiscal policies since the 1980s. Now, slope is a useful metaphor. I think it's one we should be using more. We know about the dangers of steep slopes. Engineers know, especially. Landslides can happen on steeply sloping land. Those at the bottom of the slope are overwhelmed by a slip from above. The foundations of any structure built on a slope will slip away. But building on the top of the cliff is risky too, as some people have found in recent months. Now, what I want to suggest is that great inequality is socially risky, like living on a slope. It is living on a slope. Research shows that societies in which that slope is steeper have less good measures of overall well-being in terms of, for instance, health and life expectancy. It's an extraordinary statistic that infant mortality rates in Cuba are lower than they are in the United States. The chance of a baby surviving its first 2 years in the United States are less good than they are in the enormously poorer country of Cuba. And the argument is that it is the disparity between rich and poor that's the crucial thing. Not just those at the bottom of the socio cliff who are in danger, but those who built at the top of the cliff. They too will be subject to crime, unrest, problems with health and education systems. They affect everyone. So the argument is that it's in all our interest that the slope should be flattened out. There is also, that just as there's a tendency to focus exclusively on the plight of the poorest in public discussion, so there's a tendency, and you've seen this over the last months before the election, there's a tendency to focus on getting the richest 1% to pay more tax. I want to suggest that to flatten the slope, it's obvious that we need, firstly, to increase the income of the lower 50%, but secondly, that would be done by taxing the wealth of the top 10%, not the top 1%, the top 10%. Now, you may reflect whether you are one of that top 10%. See the cover of Max Rashbrook's recent book, Too Much Money, he says. And then he says how wealth disparities are unbalancing Aotearoa New Zealand. You notice that balance metaphor is coming back? He's saying it's unbalancing. We need to rebalance it. So we go back to Jack Woodward and achieving balance. Now I want to move on to another broad observation. And that is that progressive thinking is inherently more complex and so harder to communicate than its rivals. It's not just a matter of using different metaphors. What I want to suggest is that progressive thinking typically looks at the past and the future. Conservatives look just to the past, or primarily to the past. They want to conserve. Progressives look equally at rights and responsibilities, whereas neoliberals, so many of their followers, look just to their rights. I've heard people insisting, approaching this election and during the COVID crisis, that their rights were being infringed. And progressives also look equally at the individual and the collective. They're looking in both directions. Neoliberals look just at the individual, whereas nationalists and communists look just to the collective. Now, what I'm suggesting is that it's harder to convey those kinds of complex progressive thinking, looking in this direction and that direction. This is where creating effective narratives or stories is crucial. Crude populist thinking tends to look for single causes, single solutions for social issues, or the rise in youth crime, for instance. They look to single solution. Oh, okay, imprisonment. That's the answer. We need to imprison more. We need to get more police. A well-developed narrative or story is capable of conveying the complexity of the issue, drawing in wider questions, establishing a context, and referring to the many contributing causes and combination of solutions. But metaphors can still be helpful too. Youth crime is just the tip of an iceberg of social alienation. Now, the second major topic that I think needs to be reframed is the topic of the housing crisis. Now, I'm aware that reframing housing is a rather awful pun, but I should say I do voluntary work for an organisation in Warkworth, which is called Home Builders, which is a family support organisation. And there too, the question of puns is a problem. They get phone calls quite regularly from people asking them to do some construction for them. But here, what I'm talking about, the housing crisis, I'm going to use a mainly narrative approach, not so much metaphor, more narrative. There's a tendency to frame the housing crisis in oversimple ways on the basis of another set of assumptions, based on a kind of standard narrative. This is the conventional framing, as I think occurs in New Zealand. And I have to say that it applies equally to National Party and the Labour Party, and evidently did so in the recent election. First assumption is most New Zealanders will want to and should be able to buy a home. That's the standard narrative. Those homes will mostly be standalone houses on their own section. Doing so will not only guarantee their accommodation in the long term, but with a steady increase in value of the house, it will act as a growing investment asset. They will be able to retire on the basis of having so much money involved in their house. That is New Zealanders' right. Now, the assumption is that a small number won't be able to, and they will rent homes. Bad investors heavily on Kaingaora to supply rental accommodation to most not most valuable, most vulnerable. These are the standard narratives that establish, I think, our default frame. Now, how might you critique these conventional assumptions? The first is they're not realistic. We've seen how the process of the building up of the nest egg for retirement experienced by people of my generation, baby boomers, has made houses less and less affordable for those who still need to get into the market, both to buy and to rent. Rents and mortgages in New Zealand are eating up larger and larger proportions of income. You hear of many people paying 40% of their weekly income, or 40 and 50% and more of their weekly income, either on their rent or occasionally on their mortgage. One of the consequences of that is that too much of our domestic capital is invested in housing. It's estimated that around 80% of domestic capital is actually in the houses that people own. Now, what that does is limit extraordinarily our capacity to invest in productive areas of the economy. Houses are fine to live in, homes are fine to live in, but they don't generate further income, except in terms of growing value, it's true. And what that does is limit, especially, our prospects for local ownership of major industries. And you will have seen so many laments recently about how little of New Zealand's productive industry is owned by New Zealanders. This is one of the major reasons. The other thing is that small private investors, mum and dad investors, have neither the competence nor the interest to meet the needs of renters. Mum and dad investors want always to be able to sell a property if it's got to a point in its value, and if they've got to a point in their lives when they spreading like infrastructure, of course, requiring more car travel. The housing issue. This links closely to the poverty inequality discussion, I think. We should be thinking, I suggest, of decent housing, taking up reasonable proportion of household incomes for long-term occupation in warm, secure homes, in thriving neighbourhoods, and I'd emphasise neighbourhoods, and they should all be seen as a human right. That's what the New Zealand Human Rights Commissioner insists year after year. Now, one of the things about something being regarded as a human right, having that official title, is that it becomes the responsibility of government. And successive governments in New Zealand have not seen that right as being inalienable, and haven't seen that it is primarily their responsibility, not the responsibility of the market, to deal with. So rather than relying on ownership, we should be focusing on affordability, quality, good living conditions. And then we should look to other countries and see that high ownership rates, which is assumed in New Zealand and Australia and the UK, high ownership rates are not a guarantee of prosperity and well-being. Do you know that in Europe, the countries with the highest home ownership rates are two of the poorest, that is Romania and Hungary? What we need to do is look at best practice in countries which have high rates of rental, like Austria, for instance, which is an outstanding example, where 40% of the population rent, and by and large are happy to do so. So many people will say they have no interest in purchasing a house. The national and local governments in Austria see it as their obligation, or have seen in the past, with some erosion of that recently, have seen it in the past as their obligation to ensure sufficient homes built, guarantees of long tenure, and reasonable rents. So there is no need to buy. The aim is to build communities in the form most often of apartment developments rather than single houses, with a high regard for environmental quality. This is an example. In New Zealand, an example like this, the children would be a bit browner, I think. And in these rental facilities, they have a mix of subsidized renters and renters paying the full cost. So not separate state houses or state housing blocks. In addition, they encourage cooperative and community-run developments. Now, apartments like this, complexes like this, are built by state and local. Also, there is a system in Austria called limited profit housing associations. And the point about limited profit housing associations is that they are private entities, often springing from big holders of capital, big companies, who have seen it as their obligation, as one of their social obligations, to provide housing of this kind. I don't know whether you've seen what Simplicity Living in New Zealand has started to do, but they are aiming to do something of the same sort. And the point about limited profit housing associations is that they are obliged by law to limit their profits to around 3%, to retain them within the organization, and to provide decent and affordable housing. Now, more broadly still, I want to suggest that we live, think, relate, work, and have just voted on the basis of a bundle of metaphor plus narrative links, shortcuts by which we conceive of the world around us, what some psychologists and sociologists call our social imaginary. This is how they think of the social imaginary. For some of us, our social imaginary will contain considerable resources of theory, information, and experience. But for most people, it's a very rough and ready, by no means entirely conscious, bundle of shortcuts. It's made up very largely of simplifying metaphors and stories, some on a grand scale, others on a more limited, even personal scale. These serve as a template against which we measure ideas and information that are presented to us. Different elements of this template are linked to and reinforce each other. For example, assumptions about why people commit crimes and assumptions about the extent to which we have free choice. Nevertheless, there will also be contradictions that the individual thinker is usually not aware of. Excuse me. A key example of such a contradiction is the desire so many people express for better provision of public health care, public education, public roading, which sits alongside their insistence that there should be no increase in taxation to pay for. However thoughtful and well-informed anyone is, their understanding of areas in which they're not specifically expert will take this sort of simple schematic form. Different people will have different sets of assumptions according to their culture, according to their personal experience, their education. Some will have a religious narrative and metaphor component, for instance, and others won't. Examples of such metaphor narrative links would be those race or ladder images, or the wealth as a cake, unevenly shared image, or the traditional assumptions about housing in New Zealand that I've just referred to, that we should all be able to buy a house, should all expect to. Because those assumptions have come from different sources, the elements of an individual social imaginary won't necessarily be coherent. In fact, they will often be thoroughly incoherent. And any new ideas and information we meet are subjected to testing against that social imaginary. Mostly, those new ideas pass or fail the test. Either they do or they don't fit. Now, I'm very near to the end now. Mostly, those new ideas pass or fail the test. Only occasionally is the social imaginary itself altered, or some part of the social imaginary, when evidence for change builds up so high that what's called a paradigm shift occurs. That term paradigm shift was coined by modern thinkers looking at the period in which Copernicus and others managed finally to gain recognition that actually, you know, the Earth revolves around the sun, not vice versa, like the discovery about the heart being a pump. a vast amount of evidence had built up bit by bit over the centuries. But the shift to the new thinking didn't occur bit by bit. It occurred very late, suddenly, like a dam bursting, when it was clear that the old model would not survive. So I'm suggesting that progressives should be seeking to achieve a paradigm shift in each of many dimensions, many aspects of the social imaginary of the population at large. And I've just taken 2 examples. So what are some of the big issues that you think need reframing? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was absolutely fantastic. There's so much to think about. I'm just going to move to the gallery, back to the gallery. Probably a good idea if you put off your share screen now. Oh, no, I leave the questions up. Have we got any?
Yes.
Yeah, that's good.
Does that work?
Yep.
Okay. See if I can. No, if I do full screen. Let's see if I go back to this.
It's
yes.
those 3 questions.
Is that okay?
It's okay for the time being. It's just that I can't see the gallery to see if anyone's got.
No, okay, right. No, I'll end the show then. And
but there's so much. I mean, we've had some good presentations this year, and I think yours is the best. And I'm thinking now that we really.
You say that to all of them, Jeff.
Well, I think we really need to hear you every year. so there's bound to be another invitation for next year. Right?
I'm sorry, I stumbled over it a bit in a way that I don't usually. So I apologize for that.
Well, so I'm not a good thinker on my feet, but I certainly know that engineering is full of metaphors, and it has its own narrative. So, and I don't have any argument against anything that you've said. Any comment from anyone else? There's one, Doug.
Just before you ask your question, Doug, Michael, can you stop sharing the screen? You just went out of your PowerPoint presentation, but you are still in Zoom sharing your screen.
Oh, I'm sorry. No. Okay.
Yes.
Right. My apologies. Yeah.
That's fine.
Thank you, Michael. I very much enjoyed that, and I agree with it certainly aligns a lot with the thinking that I have. Sorry, I'm Doug Wilson. I'm also in University of Auckland, but in the engineering school and civil environmental engineering. Very much enjoyed what you had to say. I suppose my question back to you is, how do we change the conversation? Because I think many of us, wouldn't have any arguments with what you're saying, but with the elections that we've had, the widening gap between those that have and those that haven't, the inequalities that we're seeing that are driving a lot of other social issues, and then also but how do we, given that we have to work with the guy, we haven't got a choice to, and we don't want to throw them out like some other countries might want to do if they don't like, but how do we change the narrative in your terms going forward, other than obviously starting the conversation, which is important? How do we generate that within our own professions, but also within the public, to understand the importance of some of these issues and how we can change? Sorry, long question, but
no. absolutely right. I think that the main thing we need to do is firstly point out the limitations we're given for each of these areas, but also start and repeat showing images like the slices of the cake one, which and the dinner party image, which I think are extraordinarily influential. I mean, anyone who sees those has to think, well, there's something wrong here, isn't there? And also has to think about what kinds of solutions there might be. And as you will agree, I think the discussion pre-election has been very largely about whether or not that wealthiest 1% should in some way be taxed. But that's just missing the point. So I think we need to find really good metaphors and images and point to the narratives that spill from them. So what do you do if people are as unequally able to get food as they are at the dinner table image? You ask that question, and you ask it repeatedly. I think you have to keep using the metaphors that you think work and the narratives that you think work. Now that you may feel that's not much of an answer, but I think what is clear is that to a very large extent, and a lot of work's been done on this right around the world, is that progressives find themselves using the simplifying neoliberal metaphors that are that dominate in society. So the question is, how do you get your metaphors, your images, more widely used? You may feel that's not any kind of solution.
I wasn't expecting to give one. Let's do two or three things to change, because I know it's complex. But I'll let other people ask questions.
So can I say one other thing too, which is that I think it's really important that one finds metaphors which reinforce each other. In other words, you find clusters of metaphors, clusters of images. I think you said you're an environmental engineer, and I think Kate Raworth's image of the donut, the environmental donut, where you mustn't exceed the outer limit in terms of impact on the environment, and you mustn't fall below the inner circle in terms of ensuring people's well-being. I mean, I think that's a wonderful metaphor. You may feel it's not entirely adequate, but I think it does a damn good job.
Just as a comment, I think part of our problem is the modern day concept of popularism. When to me, I mean, Donald Trump said the other night at a rally, I love the undereducated. We're the really smart ones. And what he's saying there is it's the opinions of ordinary people are the most important. We're in a society, we don't know of anywhere where we exalt the ordinary over the expert. We don't even get our hair cut by ordinary people. We go to hairdressers. So, where does this end? And I think it's part of the same, part of the same problem, isn't it, about metaphor and narrative?
Sure, I wouldn't, but because we live in democracy, we are dependent on, and we need to influence the views of at least the majority of the population. One of the things about the cake metaphor and image is that it shows you that 90% of the population is living either within or below a level which you could regard as reasonable. The 40% who are living, pretty much reasonable lives. The 50% who are not. Now, one of the things that's happened about in discussion about taxation is that it's been assumed that most people have got the impression that they are going to lose by changing the tax system, whereas looking at the cake, you would have to say that 90% of the population would gain by a reform of the tax system. What I would insist is that people shouldn't regard taxation as an end; it must be regarded as a means. There are people who have formed organisations called fair tax, tax justice, etc. But I think they're actually putting the cart before the horse. The central thing surely must be the well-being of the great majority of the population, and then you think about the taxation means by which you might achieve them. Sorry, I can see Brian wants to talk.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Michael. This is a great discussion. I I wonder about your graph, which is very correct, and the thing about that graph is it doesn't enter the public consciousness. It sits in economic areas and in people's sort of zones and doesn't, I regularly write letters to the paper in Christchurch, and I try to put that graph in simple terms that people might understand in various different ways and forms. And it's a challenge, you just can't get people to think that deeply about things. And so that's the challenge. The whole thing about complexity, and that's the other side of all of this, is it's a systems thing. It's a systems thinking area, and most people do not engage in that complicated thinking. I think this is where the challenge is. It's not that everybody's stupid. It's just that they haven't learned how to take a number of different factors into account and see what's going on. So I just keep battling away at that, but to sort of basically wake up people who will have influence by their by being involved.
I think you're absolutely right. Statistics are extraordinarily difficult to convey to a wide public, the validity and utility of statistics, but also pictures, images are hard to convey in words. A picture is worth a thousand words, and if we can get those pictures out, that would help greatly. That's another of the reasons why I think the Cape Raworth donut economy image is such a useful one, but it's incredibly hard to convey in verbal terms.
Yeah, when you mentioned the housing situation with the large houses on small sections, I sort of a term called the rattle around ratio. This is all related to the housing called the great indoors. These big houses that are semi-investment, 80% investment, 20% living in. The great indoors, and with a very high rattle around ratio that are quite unpleasant places to live in if there's only one or two here.
Yeah.
And how do we sort of, try and transform that whole investment and nest egg idea away from housing, into other things? That's another huge challenge for the productive side of investment and venture capital. Last week I was in a conference on social investment and impact investing in Christchurch here. they're a very interesting group run by a bloke by the name of Stephen Moe, M-O-E. The Seeds podcast is this podcast, and he is steering with a lot of discussion on social investment and impact investing, which is getting away from maximizing profit, and it's all to do with housing and all sorts of other initiatives, and I can see that there's a lot emerging from that, and but it's a long discussion, this getting away from maximizing profit, not just making a profit, but maximizing profit, which has been the paradigm for years. It's illegal not to maximize profit.
Yeah.
And the paradigm shift has to be balanced profit making. And so I'll just throw that one at you as well.
I think one of the key ways of reframing or reorienting discussion is to get people talking about neighbourhoods. I did election flyer delivery with a friend to 650 new houses, almost identical, large on small sections, not far from where I live. They had really nice gardens, well tended gardens. Of course, being so close to each other, their side windows looked out onto the side window of the next house. But the extraordinary thing about this area, we delivered, I think, 650 flyers, and there must have been 800. We didn't get to all the houses. There must have been 800 of them. And it had no sense of being a neighborhood at all. It had no community center. It had one coffee stall for the whole of the population. It's reasonably recently built, of course. Had no community center, no shops. You had to drive in there to get to it. Two cars at each house. It'd be 1.3 million, 1.4 million, something like that. But in terms of neighborhood, it was bloody appalling. And I wonder if we can direct people's attention more to neighborhoods. I don't know how many of you are in Auckland. I go occasionally to a restaurant or theatre in the Wynyard Quarter in Auckland. And now that's a very upmarket area, but it has so many of the qualities that I think are good about an excellent, a really well-developed neighborhood. Apartments 4 to 5 stories tall. They're not 20 stories, 4 or 5 stories tall. They've got shops very often, and entertainment places and cafes on the ground floor. And then above them, there are obviously very nice apartments. Now, why people aren't thinking that kind of format, though less expensive, why people aren't thinking that really might be a good kind of neighborhood to live in, I do not know. It's an educational thing. People talk about financial literacy, but I think they need to talk about social literacy and environmental literacy and so many other kinds.
Sustainability literacy.
Sustainability literacy, exactly.
Michael, can I make a couple of comments? Thanks for an excellent talk. It was really nice to see that you started with Jack Woodward, who was a founder of ESR and is also a great hero of mine. Yeah, the other comment really was that it's very interesting, isn't it, that successive leaders of the Labour Party have refused quite firmly to consider a wealth tax. And this is the Labour Party, for goodness sake. So it seems to me that that they're operating within the wrong metaphorical framework, if you like, and that if there is to be a shift, then it needs to occur, I think, within those political circles, within the Labour Party in particular, I would say. I think the Green Party is quite okay with the idea of a wealth tax. More work is needed, I think, in the metaphorical world that the Labour supporters live in. Jeff is about to make a comment on that, I think.
You know, I just want to point out, when we had a look at the cake, the wealth distribution, and we're talking about the top 10% with all the wealth, 50% are 1% of the wealth, and 40%, 90% are below halfway. So playing with the tax system isn't the problem. We've got 1% of people with all the means to avoid tax. We change the tax law, we're not necessarily going to increase the tax take. One of the big problems with our society was the privatization of monopoly and infrastructure rather than the nationalization of it. And we were better off, all countries were better off when they owned more of their own infrastructure. And that is the greatest way of distributing wealth, because wealth isn't just in dollars, it's actually in services and the healthy community. And it's the infrastructure we need to go on. We don't even have, look at us with our problem of actually getting our electricity generation to build wind farms. So there they all are approved, but they're not being built because half of them were sold by John Key to mum and dad investors. And we've got to nationalize it again. So it seems to me the tax. Now, the other thing that this government has done, not everyone is aware of it, is they've looked at how people earn money, and they've progressively gone one step after another to actually tax that as income. Now, Colin and I own a farm, and we've made a development. We've subdivided because we've covenanted land, bush, native bush on it. We got 3 titles, and we were allowed to put it into a subdivision. The Labor government has increased the tax in the trust to 33%. Now, when we sell those sections, we will be paying 33% tax. Now, what do you mean by capital gains tax? This government was already dealing with that and not calling it capital gains tax. The only things that are left for capital gains tax, when you think about it, is the private home or shares on the stock market. And you don't want to start to tax shares on the stock market because we've actually got a problem with too much investment in housing and not enough in productive industry. So it's not a simple job. I mean, it's one of the things that's coming clear now is in an expanding universe, everything is getting more complex. And what we have to avoid is the easy solution. And that's really where narrative and metaphor come in again. Things are actually more complex every day, not less. The universe was a simple place 100 years ago.
I think one of the things I want to suggest is that it's identifying what we see as the problems, that is what we need to be focusing on, rather than on possible immediate solutions, which is like taxation. So I think we need to have an ongoing national discussion about what our society is like and how we would like it to be, how we think it could be improved, in what ways we think it needs to be better. What, for instance, would good neighbourhoods look like? Would they be everybody the same colour, same social class, same kind of occupation, or would they be much more mixed up and interactive? It seems to me that we've got to have those ongoing discussions, and that's the responsibility of good political parties. And I think as a long-time Labour supporter and activist, that I think is what the Green Party have done extraordinarily well. They've said, look, these are the issues, these are the problems, and let's have a discussion about them. Now, Green Party have only got a relatively small percentage, but it's about half what Labour has got. I don't want to get into party politics immediately, but they've shown us how it can be done, and I think the Greens have made considerable inroads into getting that kind of public discussion going.
Well, we've got this is not just a New Zealand problem either. It's in all of our democratic countries. Is communicating what a good socialist government has achieved. Biden has the same problems. When you have a look at the legislation that's passed through in the Biden presidency, it's all going in the right direction. But the people don't understand that. We will see Labour go into the UK shortly, and they'll be up against the same problems. And we've just lost a government that was, and as far as I can work out in all of my life, is the best government we've ever had. So what happened when we lost it? It wasn't the government doing anything wrong. It's that for all the goodwill and intelligence in the Labour Party, we still fail to work out how to communicate it in the modern environment.
I think
metaphor and narrative have become very important in everything we do from now on.
I think, well, I don't, you and I can have this, the Labour Party discussion separately, can't we? But it does seem to me that what the Labour Party absolutely failed to do was involve the bulk of the population in a national discussion. What they did was came up far too often with free waters, with centralisation of the health system, with centralisation of the politics. They came up with a solution and then explained why it was necessary. And that's just not the way to win friends and influence people. You've got to get the discussion going without preempting the solutions. And that's what I think has absolutely failed. The Labour Party has absolutely failed, and indeed so many relatively progressive parties do. You need to look around parts of Europe, especially northern Europe, to see how these things can be done well. That, for instance, to have a relatively low income in Finland or in Denmark doesn't consign you to the dustbin. It consigns you to a good education system, a good health system, a good public transport system, etc. Actually, the income you have doesn't matter nearly so much. Perhaps if Douglas wants to speak.
Yeah, I was going to perhaps be a little bit controversial in the sense that I'm going to pose a sort of question in the sense that, I mean, I completely agree with it. It's complex systems, Jeff, and it's and will become more and more complex in our society and the way we do things. And that has created tensions across all sorts of different areas. And I'm going to use sustainability and environmental engineering here as a sort of example where I think we now have people that are, let's call it in brackets, greenwashing, where big business actually sees great opportunities to be sustainable and to be more environmental, and all they're interested in is the economic benefit that they can get is the value that they've got. So I think we've got a real crisis both within our organizations, within the engineering profession, that we are now greenwashing sustainability in a way that is moving away from making real change and the real need to do this. I mean, we use electrification as a good example on this. Who's getting the value and who's getting the benefit out of that at the moment? All the incentives and the disincentives are going to those that can't afford, because we've got a race to try to meet a target by many countries wanting to do the same thing, and there are people that are winning significantly the value out of that, and we're chasing now a dream, and some people are getting significant benefits out of that, and it's increasing that 1% we talked about against those that can't afford to actually get access to that system. And so I come back to your discussion around neighbourhoods, and that the neighbourhoods, and I mean, I do a lot of work in transport, that's my area. Transport is the great enabler, I think, in terms of opportunities. And yet we're turning that now into something that we want to disincentivize people being able to have that access, because we're penalizing them to be able to have that because of environmental reasons, because they can only afford a fossil fuel-based car, for example. And so I think these are tensions. We understand why we want to become greener, we want a low carbon future in terms of transport systems, but there are significant tensions there for lower socioeconomic groups. How do we do that and transition equitably are significant problems that we need to consider. And we're not doing that well at the moment. We're actually widening that by giving value to people that don't even have to pay anything in terms of their tax systems.
I absolutely agree with you, and I don't have the expertise that you have in the area, but I think that's absolutely right. And neighbourhoods and availability of public transport and all other resources, education, healthcare, etc. They're all very much interwoven with each other, with transport being at the centre.
Absolutely, and so my biggest concern is that when you go to talk to people that are involved in transport in the Greens Party or the Labour Party or the National Party or whatever party is, that they want to turn it into a binary discussion. They want to say it's either this or that. It's either public transport or roads. It's either cycling or walking or not this or not that. And actually it dumbs down the whole issue such that we get this very binary fight, competition against the sector, which is not helpful at all, because it's actually a bit of all of those things. We actually need to advance across all of those areas, giving people opportunities and even out that gradient that you talked about. And we're actually making that steeper because of that at the moment. So yeah, it's a tricky, and there's real tensions in there. I do understand it's not easy to do, but we've got to have our narrative right and being able to understand it. So I get called up all the time to have this discussions because they think that I'm going to go on a certain side of the argument. And I'm always trying to say it's much more complex than that. You've got to think about these wider issues. But the media don't want to know the wider issues or the complexity of the issues. They want you to pin your on one thing about it. And that's this problem is the complexity of the issues they don't understand.
That takes you back. Sorry. That takes you back, doesn't it, to the points that I was making again about non-binary. Yes. That is, progressive thinking is individual and collective. It's freedom and responsibility, etc. And arguing those cases is extraordinarily difficult. I think a really nice example, and I think practical examples from other countries can be really helpful here. I mentioned the limited profit housing associations that they've used historically in Austria. Now, those are, as I said, that they are capitalist enterprises who have set aside a bit of their capital for what they see as socially progressive purposes. Now, they have been encouraged to do that by successive governments in Austria, mostly social democratic governments, but not only. They've been encouraged to do that by being given concessions on taxation, concessions on land acquisition. And so there is the kind of blending there of government intervention and private enterprise, which just darn well seems to work. And that's how such a large proportion of housing developments have been constructed and run in Austria. I can see Brian wanting to talk.
Yeah.
Yes, Brian. Yeah.
I was been tossing around for some time since the idea of making essential services cost break even rather than profit maximize, and I can't, I don't know where anybody else's thinking is on this, but to provide opportunity and more equity, surely if we set up our basic services as like we incentivize CEOs to break even rather than maximize their profit, and the whole system, and just for the essential services, which is electricity, real estate, banking, and food, maybe. you know, if these were, if chief executives were given a bonus on how close they got to break even, you know, why could that not, you know, without saying it's communist, why couldn't that work within a capitalist system, giving everybody an equal opportunity?
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. The tricky thing about that is that the incentive goes to the chief executive, whereas the effort is likely to come from everybody else along the line, doesn't it? And
yeah, I'm using it as a model insight rather than knowing all the you know, the detail of it all, because surely the whole team, the people that run the essential service, are equally incentivized. You know, I mean,
yeah,
it's a model, it's a paradigm shift without being communist. You know, I mean, that's the sort of questions I ask. Why does everybody across the political spectrum push back against this sort of idea? I mean, is it you know, what am I if I speak like that?
Sure, sure.
There was never anything wrong with the idea of each, you know, to their capabilities and to each to their need. There's nothing wrong with that idea. It's meant to be communism, but it's actually what families do, from each according to their ability and to each according to their need. It's just what families do.
Yeah, it's the collective. You know, the idea that you have a sort of a global consciousness. You're actually thinking of what everything else is happening in the world, rather than what's not just. I know the family model is a subset of that, but you're thinking of others. You're thinking of what's happening elsewhere, not just what I can do and get. And yeah, I just wonder if our thinking needs to broaden a bit. You know.
I think it undoubtedly does, and it's so interesting to see in a country like Denmark, for instance, which I know very little. Many people on, you know, good incomes will be paying 50% of their income in taxation, income tax. And you ask them that, but you know, that must make life hard. No, that's fine. We get really good services for it, and it's that kind of rethinking of, as you say, change of public attitudes, change of public thinking. Remember seeing a piece about education in either Norway or Finland. I don't remember which it was, and the person interviewing, I think, was from the United States. Said, "So, what do you do with failing schools?" And the teacher responding, and several teachers responded and said, "What do you mean? We don't have failing schools. We don't let them fail. All schools are resourced to make sure that they really work."
Yeah, this is this zero-sum game attitude, which, you know, could be seen as the thing that happens in New Zealand politics. You know, that we win, you lose.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Michael. And yeah, that was a wonderful presentation. And I look forward to having more conversations with you later.
Yes. you and I will. I know that.
And I would really like to have you back again